Picture this. You wake up, no phone, no alarm clock, no calendar on the wall. You don't know the date. You don't even know what time it is. And here's the question. How do you know when to plant wheat? When winter is coming, when your child is due, when to run because a flood is about to swallow your cave? Sounds like a nightmare. But for our ancestors, this was just life. Normal everyday reality, and the wild part is they managed. Not just survived, but managed so well that some of their methods were more accurate than what your smartphone shows you right now. Yeah, I'm not joking. Let's break down exactly how. Let's start with the most obvious tool every human had access to from birth, the sky. The sun was humanity's first alarm clock. It rose, people woke up. It set, people prepared for darkness because night was genuinely dangerous. Predators, cold, not being able to see where you're stepping. But the sun gave more than just morning evening. People quickly noticed something. The shadow from a tree, a rock, a stick pushed into the ground. It moves in a circle and changes length. A short shadow means peak heat, midday. A long shadow means morning or evening, and that's when something important happened. A person took a stick, pushed it into the ground, and started tracking the shadow deliberately. This is essentially the first sundial, a gnomon, a primitive device, but it worked for thousands of years, long before anyone invented the word clock. From the length and direction of the shadow, you could tell not just the time of day, but roughly the time of year too, because the angle of sunlight changes from summer to winter. But the sun only solves one problem, the day. What about longer cycles? That's where the second, even more convenient tool comes in, the moon. The moon is essentially a ready-made natural calendar hanging right above your head. It changes shape every night, and this cycle repeats roughly every 29 to 30 days. You don't need to count anything, just look up. A full moon means about 2 weeks have passed since the new moon. A thin crescent means a new cycle is just beginning. And here's the funny thing. The word month in many languages literally comes from the word moon. Not a coincidence. Ancient people literally measured time using lunar cycles because it was the only reliable natural phenomenon that repeated over and over, visible to everyone at once with no instruments needed. Women tracked pregnancy cycles by the moon. Hunters knew certain animals became more active at night during a full moon. Fishermen knew which lunar phases meant better fishing because of the tides. All of this without a single number written down, just watching the sky pass down from generation to generation. But that's still not all, because the sun and moon give you days and months. What about the year? How do you know winter is coming so you can prepare supplies? For that, people looked even higher, to the stars. The ancient Egyptians, for example, noticed that shortly before the Nile flooded, one particular bright star would appear on the horizon just before dawn, Sirius. It would be invisible for months, and then suddenly reappear right before sunrise. And this reappearance lined up with the start of the rivers flooding almost every single year. Farmers literally watched this one star to know it's time to prepare, the water is coming, which would either drown the harvest or, if you were ready, make the soil incredibly fertile. This is genuinely brilliant if you think about it. No written calendar, no math in the way we understand it, just years of watching the sky turned into a survival system. And now for the part I saved for last, because in my opinion, it's the most underrated piece of this entire story. You probably assume the first calendars were some kind of religious objects or works of art. Nope, the first known calendars are bones with notches carved into them. A regular bone with a person carving rows of marks into it with a knife. There's a find called the Lubombo bone. It's about 40,000 years old. It has 29 notches. Not a random number, it almost perfectly matches the lunar cycle, meaning a human being tens of thousands of years ago took a bone and literally counted days, the same way we tap through an app to check the date today. Another find, the Ashongo bone, about 20,000 years old, with a more complex notch system that some researchers interpret as an early attempt to track lunar months across several seasons in a row. Just imagine, long before writing, long before the wheel, humans were already keeping time records. Not because it looked pretty, because their lives depended on it. Knowing when to harvest certain plants, when the herds they hunted would migrate, when the rainy season would begin. And this is where we get to the strongest part of this whole video. Because individual observations are one thing, but turning those observations into a system that can be passed on to other people, that's a completely different level. And that's exactly what really saved ancient communities from starvation and disaster. A similar story with Newgrange in Ireland. A tomb built so that once a year, exactly on the winter solstice, a beam of rising sunlight travels through a narrow passage and lights up the inner chamber for just a few minutes. Only a few minutes, once a year. That's not an accident. That's deliberate, remarkably precise engineering created by people who didn't even have basic writing. But the most powerful part of this whole story isn't the stones, it's the people. Because all this knowledge about the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, animal migrations didn't live in books. It lived in people's heads, in oral traditions, in rituals, songs, and stories that elders told the younger ones around a fire. The tribal elder was a living calendar, a living database. He remembered how many moons had passed since the last major flood, when the last time a summer this long had happened, where the herds went in years like this one. Rituals and festivals weren't just tradition for tradition's sake. They were a reminder system woven into culture so that nobody forgot to plant on time, migrate on time, prepare for the cold on time. Losing one elder with a sharp memory could literally mean losing an entire calendar archive for the whole community. And here's something strange and beautiful at the same time. Despite having no clocks, no calendars, no alarms, no notifications on a phone, these people were often more precisely synced with nature than we are now. Their bodies, their sleep, their appetite, all of it adjusted to the natural rhythms of light and darkness, to the changing seasons. That same internal biological mechanism is still in us too. Circadian rhythms still dictate when we feel sleepy and when we feel active. We've just drowned out that signal with artificial light, coffee, and notifications at 2 a.m., which makes for a funny contrast. Ancient humans had no clocks, but they had a sense of time. We have clocks everywhere, but the sense of time is exactly what we've lost. And if you start digging deeper, how did people learn to predict not just the seasons, but fate, harvests, wars by watching the stars, creating the earliest systems that would later evolve into astrology and eventually real astronomy? That's where an even stranger story begins. In ancient Babylon, priests didn't just watch the sky out of curiosity. They watched it because their entire political and religious system depended on it. They divided the visible sky into sections, the same zodiac constellations you still see in horoscope apps today, and they tracked which planets moved through which section on which night. At first, this was purely practical, predicting when the Tigris and Euphrates would flood, when to plant barley, when the hot season would break. But over centuries, it turned into something bigger. Babylonian priests started recording unusual events, a red moon, a comet, an eclipse, and comparing them to what happened afterward in the kingdom, a bad harvest, a war, the death of a king. Enough of these coincidences piled up, and people started to believe the sky wasn't just marking time, it was warning them. That belief is the actual root of astrology as we know it. Not fortune-telling for entertainment, but a survival tool that slowly mutated into a belief system about fate. The Egyptians took a slightly different approach. On top of watching Sirius for the Nile floods, they built an entire nighttime clock system using something called decans, 36 groups of stars spaced evenly across the sky. As the night went on, a new decan would rise roughly every 40 minutes. Priests assigned to temple duty could look up in the middle of the night and know almost exactly how much time had passed purely by which decan was currently rising. That's a working star clock, accurate enough to organize religious rituals down to specific hours, thousands of years before anyone built a mechanical clock. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Chinese astronomers were doing something arguably even more impressive, keeping one of the longest unbroken records of sky watching in human history. They tracked comets, eclipses, and something called guest stars and what we now know were supernovae for well over 2,000 years, written down generation after generation. That record is so precise that modern astronomers still use ancient Chinese court records today to date historical supernova remnants. On top of that, Chinese farmers used a lunisolar calendar broken into 24 solar terms, each one tied to a real seasonal shift, a term literally named insects awaken, marking the exact window when it was warm enough for hibernating insects to come out, which also happened to be the ideal time to start certain planting. That's not poetry, that's applied agricultural science encoded into a calendar and repeated for thousands of years. And then there's the Maya, who might be the single most obsessive sky watchers in ancient history. They didn't just track the sun and moon, they tracked Venus with terrifying precision, timing its cycle to within a couple of hours of accuracy over centuries of observation, using nothing but eyes and patient record keeping. Venus wasn't just a pretty light to them. It was tied directly to decisions about warfare. Maya rulers would time military campaigns to specific points in the Venus cycle, believing the planet's position influenced the outcome. Whether or not you believe in that that link, the engineering behind it is undeniable. They built a functioning long-term astronomical prediction system without telescopes, without algebra as we know it, purely through generations of disciplined observation passed down and refined. And it wasn't only farmers and priests who depended on the sky, sailors did too, and nowhere more dramatically than in the Pacific. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean between islands that are sometimes barely visible dots on a map, without compasses, without written charts, without any instruments at all. They read star paths, memorizing exactly where specific stars rose and set on the horizon, and using that as a bearing. They read ocean swells, since even in open water, certain currents create consistent wave patterns that bend around distant islands long before land is visible. They watched the flight patterns of specific seabirds that always returned to land at night, which told them roughly which direction the nearest island was. This entire navigation system lived in memory and chant. Young navigators would spend years memorizing star compasses through songs, repeating them until the pattern was as automatic as breathing. And it worked. It got people safely across some of the most remote ocean distances on the planet, centuries before European sailors managed the same feat with actual instruments. So here's the pattern once you zoom out. In every single one of these cultures, Babylon, Egypt, China, the Maya, Polynesia, completely disconnected from each other. With no shared contact, humans arrived at the same basic instinct. Look up, watch carefully, remember precisely, and pass it down without fail. Nobody told them to build a calendar, nobody handed them a system. They built it out of necessity, refined it over unimaginable stretches of time, and trusted it with their lives. And that's really the whole point of this video. We tend to imagine ancient people as primitive, stumbling around with no real understanding of the world, waiting for civilization to hand them clocks and calendars so they could finally get organized. But it's the opposite. They were organized long before any of that existed. Their organization just didn't look like ours. It looked like a shadow on the ground, a notch on a bone, a star rising at a certain angle, a grandmother remembering how many moons passed since the last drought. We didn't invent the need to track time. We just outsourced it. Every phone alarm, every calendar notification, every countdown app is a distant descendant of a stick pushed into dirt by someone who had absolutely nothing else to rely on except their own eyes and their own memory, and made it work anyway. That's the real story here. Not that ancient people lacked tools, it's that they were the tool. Their attention, their memory, their discipline in watching the same sky night after night for an entire lifetime. That was the technology, and it was good enough to build pyramids aligned to the stars, to cross oceans with nothing but memorized star paths, and to keep entire civilizations fed season after season without a single clock ever ticking.